It's been 10 years since the battle for Terri Schiavo's life played out on a national stage, bringing to the forefront of our minds the question of end-of-life care. What is necessary? What is extraordinary? In this presentation, I want to look at the Church's teaching on medically assisted nutrition and hydration, sometimes called just assisted nutrition and hydration or artificial nutrition and hydration. That is, the question of feeding tubes. The first thing that needs to be done is to clarify the Church's language of ordinary means versus extraordinary means, and answer the question as to what constitutes extraordinary care versus ordinary care that's due to any human being. The Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Institutions, published by the USCCB in 2009, that's the 5th edition, the most recent edition, states in number 56, "Those things that in the judgment of a patient offer reasonable hope or of benefit and do not entail excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or community are considered ordinary means. Extraordinary means, however, are those things," this is defined in number 57, "those things that in the patient's judgment do not offer reasonable hope or benefit or entail excessive burdens for the family or community." There's been a question as to whether or not the Church's teaching has changed over time or whether or not the tradition has remained the same. We'll look at this by exploring 3 different articles that analyze the teachings of Pope John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae, as well as some statements that he made in 2004, in addition to some statements by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and also the Ethical and Religious Directives of the USCCB. Main question is it a moral absolute? Must artificial nutrition and hydration be used in all circumstances, or does this only apply for patients in a persistent vegetative state? Can distinctions be made based upon particular conditions? The first article we'll look at is by Dr. Patrick Guinan. Dr. Guinan is a professor at the University of Illinois as well as a physician in Chicago. And his article, "Is Artificial Nutrition and Hydration Always Mandated?" was published in 2010 in the National Catholic Bioethics Review. He goes right after that question as to whether or not ANH is always necessary by referencing the 2009 Ethical and Religious Directives. He argues that there are exceptions. He begins by presenting the traditional teachings of the Church, starting with a quote from a 15th century Dominican, Francisco Vitoria, who says, "If a sick man can take food or nourishment with some hope of life, he is held to take that food, in the same way that he would be held to give it to one who is sick." He goes on also to look at a 1957 statement by Pope Pius XII, as well as a 1980 declaration on euthanasia from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, what the Catechism has to say about this particular topic in 1994, the Charter for Healthcare Workers in 1995, a 2004 speech of Pope John Paul II, a 2007 response of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith to some specific questions asked by the U.S. bishops, and finally, again, the Ethical and Religious Directives of 2009. He explains some of the medical conditions that might require ANH, including dementia, psychosis, a coma, either persistent vegetative state or a temporary coma, short bowel syndrome, or even frailty. He says that frailty sometimes is not even limited to a terminal condition and can begin as early as the 3rd decade. I found that particularly interesting and a little bit disturbing. He then goes on to detail the process of artificial nutrition and hydration, along with asking the question of whether or not it's always that effective. ANH is either delivered via the bloodstream, which is what would be given in the case of someone who would need it for a short-term reason, or it could be delivered directly into the gastrointestinal tract, which is the preferred method for someone who relies on it for long-term care. Unfortunately, there can be a number of limitations and side effects with both of these, mostly dealing with the placement of and the maintenance of the particular apparatus that will deliver the nutrition and hydration. Then there is the question of efficacy. Does it actually nourish, or is it just maintaining the body? Some say that it fails to prevent death or even improve the quality of life, and it might even reduce patient survival. Some doctors have said that with cancer patients that the use of artificial nutrition and hydration can actually feed the tumor rather than help the patient to maintain their life and get better. In the end, he concludes that patients have the final say, that patients are the ones who are able to determine what is ordinary and what is extraordinary, what is considered to be a burden versus a benefit. While ethicists and doctors and pastors can inform, the patient does have the final say. Of course, that means that individuals must form their consciences according to truth. In the case of someone who is diagnosed with a persistent vegetative state in which nutrition and hydration can only be delivered artificially, it is required. But in most cases, other cases that do not involve PVS, the decision to accept or reject artificial nutrition and hydration lies with the patient. The bottom line, he argues, though, is that we must always respect the human person as created in the image and likeness of God and uphold their dignity in all cases. The next article is an article by Jeanette Blandford, who gives an examination of the revisionist challenge to the Catholic tradition on providing artificial nutrition and hydration to patients in a persistent vegetative state. She believes that Pope John Paul II's thought in 2004, in that speech that he gave to healthcare workers, where he stated that the administration of food and water is not a medical act, actually introduces a revisionist position that differs from the tradition of the Church. She bases this on the doctoral work of the former Archbishop of Hartford, Daniel Cronin, who explored the Church's position up to 1958, and also on the speech of Pope Pius XII in 1957, which stated that benefits of treatment can only be determined within the context of a person's whole life. In other words, we have to look at the entire situation and not just at the particular question of should we introduce medically assisted nutrition and hydration. This benefits and burdens language was very prevalent up until that time in history. Now we use the terms ordinary and extraordinary means, as largely has replaced that particular language. The language of benefits and burdens could become a little bit of a danger zone as we study proportionalism and look at, well, should we make a decision based solely on which one outweighs the other rather than on an objective good? Speaking of objective goods, part of her conversation is concerned that the good of the bodily integrity is elevated to an absolute good, which almost borders on idolatry, that it does not properly place the bodily needs and the bodily goods subordinate to the spiritual goods. She argues that benefits and burdens must be weighed together, which I believe is a correct position. She then goes on to explain where she believes Pope John Paul II is coming from in introducing his position. She said that when he makes artificial nutrition and hydration basic health care and morally obligatory, he does so because a failure to provide that would cause death by starvation and dehydration, and to do so willingly would actually be euthanasia. Other arguments that flow from his and that follow his are those of Germain Grisey, William May, Cardinal Justin Regali, and Archbishop William Lori. They uphold and agree with Pope John Paul II's position because they see that it's focused on personhood, and they too uphold this idea of personhood and hold this up as a particular importance, that we can't reduce a person's dignity to cognitive abilities. It has to be maintained above all. They also have a problem and take issue with the quality of life language, saying that it undermines the dignity of the human person, that in introducing language that talks about the quality of life, we're not looking at objective dignity, we're not looking at objective value, but we're starting to weigh a person's value based on their abilities. And this can become a slippery slope to euthanasia. The reality is life is good regardless of quality, and this is something that what she calls the revisionist position holds. Some of the arguments against this position, which she would say are arguments for the tradition of the Church, are that it removes the person from the center of decision-making and instead places a rule at the center of the decision, and that also that long-term use of artificial nutrition and hydration could offer limited benefits and perhaps even could harm the patients. She says that the only benefit might actually be biological existence and not actually life with any value, that death is not necessarily caused by dehydration and starvation when artificial nutrition and hydration is not given, but it's actually caused by an underlying pathology. In conclusion, Blandford doesn't necessarily fault the motivation behind the revisionist position. She sees that in a world where there's been an increased acceptance of euthanasia, a pervading utilitarian ethic, and a recourse to the quality of life argument, that the dignity of the human person does indeed need to be upheld. What she mostly takes issue with are the claims of the revisionist position, which focus so much on a particular situation, that of patients in a persistent vegetative state, that in an attempt to make concrete moral norms for those situations, it seems like the concrete moral norm has been made for all situations. And while it was probably meant to help people understand the right to life and the balance between ordinary and extraordinary means, in the end, it looks like an extreme which actually ends up becoming more confusing to most lay people. Unlike Blandford's position, Elliot Bedford, a professor at St. Louis University, argues that recent church teaching, both in the Pope's statement in 2004 as well as the documents of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, are very consistent with Catholic tradition. He first goes on to make some distinctions and clarify the role of man in his own life. The fact that man has dominion over his life, not as an absolute, but as a steward. He speaks about ordinary means in a little bit different terms, in that he says that ordinary means are those things which do not create moral or physical impossibilities. And he highlights the fact that in the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith in 1980, in their state declaration on euthanasia, they use the terms proportionate and disproportionate interchangeably with ordinary and extraordinary when speaking about various medical procedures. Ultimately, he understands that the means of treatment cannot be viewed outside of relationship to the person. They always have to be viewed in relationship to the patient and their particular condition. He analyzes the views of three different theologians, William May, Kevin O'Rourke, and Richard McCormick. He states that after those statements of Pope John Paul II and the releases from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, a number of theologians began to interpret them in light of their own theological understanding of the human person. William May sees that biological life is not merely an instrumental good, and one cannot weigh goods against each other without diminishing one or the other. And he believes that extraordinary means are when treatment is futile for maintaining life. Kevin O'Rourke, on the other hand, operates from the anthropology that bodily goods are subordinate to spiritual goods, and that bodily goods must be ordered to the spiritual goods. And extraordinary care is when treatment cannot assist the human person in the attainment of spiritual activity. One of the things that I think he neglects to recognize is the Christian meaning of human suffering and the value of human suffering. Both, however, do agree with the flaws in the quality of life language that are so prevalent in medical society today, that we talk about quality of life versus the person itself, or the person himself, rather. Richard McCormick, on the other hand, maintained the quality of life language, in fact saying that every person is of equal value, but not every life is of equal value. And in that statement, I believe you can hear his proportionalism coming out. Bedford goes on to kind of highlight some of the important things about John Paul II's 2004 address. First of all, he notes the importance that he's actually speaking to medical personnel. He's not speaking to patients when he says that food and water are obligatory. He's speaking to doctors and to medical personnel and to remind them that they have an obligation to provide. While at the same time they have an obligation to provide, this does not justify them overriding the patient's right of refusal. The text does not make the patient's wishes irrelevant, but it gives a norm in case the wishes are unknown. It also highlights that this particular address says that food and water are natural means and not a medical act, that a patient remains a person, although that person happens to be sick. And it's very much in accord with natural rights and natural law. This idea of natural rights that come from natural law is based on Pope John XXIII in Pacem in Terris. Another theologian, P.J. Cataldo, interprets this 2004 declaration in terms of ordinary and extraordinary means being per se useful or per accidens useless. In other words, food and water are useful for the human person. We need them to live. We need them for our bodies. But there are some cases where food and water could actually be harmful. And so Cataldo says while food and water are by nature useful for the human person, there are circumstances where it would become per se useless. Bedford also goes on to analyze the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith statement that came out in 2007 in response to some questions of the U.S. bishops. This particular statement notes that artificial nutrition and hydration are morally obligatory in most cases, except when a patient cannot assimilate or when it cannot be delivered without significant discomfort. This is to say that if a patient is no longer able of processing food and water, then food and water, even delivered medically, is not necessarily a moral imperative. But the goals of care and the goals of end-of-life care in particular are to prevent suffering and starvation. But the death that can come from starvation and dehydration can be particularly painful. All of these things must be discussed, again, in relative to human nature and relative to the patient's condition and not just in a vacuum. We're not just going to look at analyzing medical situations without regard for a specific person's diagnoses. If patients' wishes are unknown, the physician can act with moral certitude if they withhold artificial nutrition and hydration only if it can be seen that it would be useless for that patient. But at the same time, physicians cannot establish limits within which a treatment actually would be good for the patient. It would be unjust for the patient to withhold it until that point where the nutrition and hydration would actually be rendered useless. In conclusion, Bedford reiterates that there has been no substantive change to the Church's teaching. Food and water are required, but always relative to a patient's human nature, insofar as they are per se useful. The patient, food, and water all retain their natures throughout this whole discernment of what is most essential for the patient at that time. It's also reiterated that the teaching is directed toward care personnel, so there's still room for the patient and their family members to decide what is needful and useful and what would be ordinary and extraordinary in whatever case comes. But essentially, for doctors or care personnel to assume that one is expressing mercy by withholding artificial nutrition and hydration to patients is actually dangerously close to euthanasia. In light of these articles and the Church's unwavering defense of human life from natural conception to natural death, the dignity of the human person must ever be kept at the forefront of our minds. Each case is very individual, and so the means of treatment, whether they be ordinary means or extraordinary means, must be always taken in context with the patient. This sometimes will involve the principle of double effect. But decisions should be made through careful reflection and discernment, always recognizing the proper object, end, and circumstance, and whatever decision is to be made. In this world that's pervaded by the utilitarian ethic and the throwaway culture, as Pope Francis sometimes called it, we need to be aware of those things and always take into consideration the Christian meaning of human suffering, that suffering does indeed have value, and what seems like death can actually bring life in very powerful ways. As we enter into the year of mercy, may we be particularly attentive to the needs of the most vulnerable, including the elderly and the sick, who are so often killed by indifference or out of misguided mercy.